When Adult Protective Services finally intervened and removed the remaining Whittaker family members from their collapsing world, the online conversation shifted almost instantly. Shock gave way to analysis, and analysis gave way to a deeper, more uncomfortable question. How much did Eric's own words foreshadow everything that happened? For months, viewers had listened to him describe his motives, his frustrations, and his calculations. But only in hindsight did the pattern reveal itself with unsettling clarity. People went back through old videos, clips, live streams, and voice recordings. They replayed statements that once sounded careless or off the cuff but now held a different weight. Certain phrases echoed louder than others, but none more clearly than his repeated emphasis on what mattered most to him: least work, most money. It wasn't said as a joke. It wasn't said once. It was a philosophy woven through everything he did. And once Timmy was removed by APS, once the family had been fractured and their situation made undeniably worse, people began recognizing just how closely Eric's actions followed the blueprint of his own statements. At the heart of the controversy was the simple truth that Eric had always gravitated toward content that required the least effort but brought in the highest return. In his world, the metric wasn't emotional impact, ethical responsibility, or long-term well-being of the vulnerable families he filmed. It was views, donations, income, virality, whatever earned the most attention in the shortest amount of time. This is why Timmy, from the moment he appeared on camera, became the center of Eric's universe. The problem wasn't that Timmy was lovable, he was. It wasn't that he was interesting, he was. It was that he was easy. Eric described it himself, casually and without shame. Timmy required very little oversight. When filming ended, Eric could send him off with a sandwich while he returned to social media to work on donations, messages, or what he called videograms. He admitted openly that Timmy's simplicity made everything easier for him and more profitable. To Eric, this was efficiency. To everyone else, it became evidence of exploitation. Meanwhile, Betty, Larry, Ray, and Lorraine were deemed too much work. Their needs required time. Their challenges required patience. Their presence didn't convert into guaranteed viral moments or instant donations. They were part of the background until they became obstacles to Eric's growing plans. The further people dug, the more they saw how coordinated the shift had been. In the beginning, Eric showcased the whole family. He filmed Ray eating popcorn. He filmed Betty being pampered. He filmed group outings, family birthdays, grocery trips, and conversations meant to demonstrate compassion, attachment, and involvement. It was the phase where he needed the audience to believe he cared. But somewhere between those early videos and the days leading up to APS intervention, everything changed. The family portrait narrowed. One by one, the other members faded from view until only Timmy remained. The comments about the others grew colder. Words like difficult, dangerous, unstable, and neglectful began slipping into his narratives. Their appearances on camera shrank until they became shadows on the edges of the frame. Meanwhile, Timmy's screen time exploded. The storylines followed him. The camera followed him. Donations flowed because of him. Every clip, every post, every update centered on Timmy. His clothes, his routines, his playful moments, his innocence. And Eric positioned himself as the only one who could save him. The audience didn't recognize the shift at first, because Eric's voice framed it as concern. When he criticized other family members, he framed it as truth-telling. When he dismissed their needs, he framed it as honesty. When he ignored their contributions, he framed it as focusing on safety. But through that lens, people were slowly conditioned to see the Whittaker family not as individuals but as obstacles. Obstacles standing between Eric and the attention he craved. This framing became even clearer when APS finally stepped in. Viewers who once assumed Eric was advocating for Timmy began asking a critical question. If he truly cared about the family, why were his actions so heavily influenced by what earned him the least work and the most money? Many now believe that Eric never intended to care for the entire family. His calculations told the story long before the system got involved. He analyzed the cost of caring for 3 adults. He listed the difficulties. He itemized their needs. He reduced them to numbers in a financial equation, one that didn't work out in his favor. And after doing the math publicly, viewers watched him quietly abandon the idea of caring for Ray or Lorraine entirely. Instead, he fixated on the only option that offered low effort and high return: Timmy. This pivot became the foundation for everything that followed. When the timeline was reconstructed, it became impossible to ignore how Eric's plans aligned perfectly with his financial and logistical interests. As his tone toward the other family members declined, his emotional investment in Timmy grew louder, more theatrical, more exaggerated. He emphasized affection. He emphasized connection. He played the role of a guardian, but only in front of the camera. Behind the scenes, his language told a different story. He described Ray as too much work. He described Lorraine as too much work. He described Betty and Larry as obstacles and liabilities. He described BJ in ways that intentionally invited the audience to dislike her. Yet he described Timmy as easy, manageable, convenient. It became painfully clear that Eric didn't view himself as a caretaker. He viewed himself as a content creator making strategic choices. And in the aftermath, once APS intervened, the consequences of those choices fell not on him, but on the family he claimed to protect. When Timmy was taken, the myth of Eric's heroism collapsed. People began confronting the uncomfortable truth that the person shaping the family's public image had benefited more from their suffering than from their well-being. The very actions he framed as protective became the catalyst for the family's removal. This realization sparked a broader conversation about motive. For months, people defended him. They believed he was doing good. They believed his donations were legitimate acts of compassion. They believed he was dedicated, compassionate, and burdened by the weight of responsibility. But now, in hindsight, those same clips reveal a man repeatedly hinting at his priorities. He never made a secret of it. He simply expected the audience not to notice or not to care. And for a while, many didn't. But once the family was split apart, once the consequences became real and irreversible, people began to see the pattern as it truly was: a careful blend of performance, opportunism, and selective compassion built on a simple principle he stated himself: least work, most money. The tragedy wasn't only that Eric operated under that principle, it was that he built an entire narrative around it, and the family trusted him. The viewers trusted him. The system believed him. And because of that, the family's life was restructured around a stranger's incentives. Now that the dust is settling, the question being asked isn't whether Eric meant well. The question is whether meaning well was ever the point. Because in the end, the story didn't break around an emotional failure. It broke around a financial truth. A truth that Eric revealed over and over again. He chose the path that benefited him the most, even if it harmed the people he claimed to protect. And with APS involved, those choices have consequences that can no longer be edited, deleted, or spun for views. The words he spoke so casually have resurfaced, not as jokes, but as confessions. Comment below and share your thoughts.
Hey everyone, before we get into the next part, I've got something special to share with you. If you're all about making your home smarter, cozier, and just a little bit more you, then you've got to check this out. We've partnered with Trekbo.com, a place built for people who love clever solutions and everyday comfort. From wellness and skincare must-haves to smart home gadgets, heated gear, and lifestyle tech, Trekbo is packed with products that make life easier, warmer, and way more fun. I've personally picked some of my favorite finds, things that actually work, look great, and make your day smoother. Whether it's something to simplify your morning routine, help you unwind after a long day, or bring a little innovation into your home, you'll find it there. So before you scroll past, take a quick look at trekbo.com. Trust me, it's full of discoveries waiting to make your everyday better. Alright, now let's get back to it, because after this video, you're definitely going to want to explore what Trekbo has in store for the Whittaker household community.
In the days following APS intervention, more people began revisiting the archives of Eric's journey with the Whittaker family. A timeline filled with contradictions, emotional manipulation, financial motives, and a pattern so clear in retrospect that many questioned how they had ever missed it. The deeper viewers dug, the more disturbing the picture became. What happened to the family was not a sudden crisis, but the predictable outcome of someone who approached their lives like a business model rather than a responsibility. At the core of this reevaluation was the recognition that Eric had always been calculating. He didn't hide it. In fact, he often announced it proudly, listing costs, counting donations, comparing revenue, and openly weighing which family members offered the best return on investment. What viewers once brushed off as transparency began to look more like strategizing, openly spoken but carefully framed. The first major calculation came during the period when he explored the idea of caring for all three remaining family members, Ray, Lorraine, and Timmy. On camera, he pretended to explore the possibilities with concern and empathy, but the language he used betrayed a different intent. He didn't talk about their needs in human terms. He talked about them in financial terms, using numbers, income equivalents, benefit projections, and budget breakdowns. Viewers didn't question it at the time because it looked like preparation, like due diligence, like planning for long-term care. But now, looking back, those moments read less like planning and more like justification. He wasn't weighing how to help them. He was weighing whether they were worth helping. When he calculated the cost of caring for the three, around $300,000 per year, by his own exaggerated estimate, that number became the dividing line. It was too high, too demanding, too complicated, not profitable enough. And the reason for that conclusion became painfully clear in the next videos that followed. Within days, he shifted the focus away from Ray and Lorraine entirely. The spotlight narrowed until Timmy alone remained, absorbing all of Eric's energy on camera. It wasn't subtle. Once viewers knew what to look for, they could see exactly when the pivot happened. The moment the family became too expensive in his mind, he began quietly removing them from view. Betty and Larry didn't disappear by accident. Ray didn't fade out because of health. Lorraine didn't vanish because her situation changed. They disappeared because they were work, labor he wasn't interested in doing. Timmy, on the other hand, met all the criteria Eric valued. He was easy. He didn't require constant supervision. He responded well to direction. He could be positioned in ways that drew sympathy and attention. He generated views consistently. He didn't push back. He didn't challenge authority. In Eric's own words, he could simply tell Timmy, "Go eat a bologna sandwich," and then go online to collect donations or produce more content. The simplicity of that arrangement wasn't just convenient, it was profitable. It allowed him to package a story of rescue and caregiving while putting in minimal effort behind the scenes. This created a situation in which the entire family became props in a staged narrative, and Timmy became the centerpiece. And once that pattern emerged, everything else began to make sense. One of the most troubling aspects viewers began to uncover was the way Eric had framed the other family members before shifting his focus to Timmy. He didn't simply reduce their screen time. He actively reshaped public perception of them. He showed unflattering angles. He used harsh descriptions. He portrayed them as difficult, unwell, uncooperative, or unsafe. Over time, audience sympathy shifted away from them and toward him, and toward Timmy, who appeared increasingly dependent on Eric's involvement. When people questioned why Ray wasn't around, Eric offered stories that painted Ray as unpredictable or unmanageable. When they asked about Lorraine, he hinted that she was overwhelmed or unable to be left alone. When they asked about Betty or Larry, he suggested neglect or dysfunction. These stories went largely unchallenged in real time because the viewers trusted him. But once APS stepped in, those narratives fell apart. The truth was that each negative portrayal also made Eric look more necessary, more heroic, more essential. It was a strategy that worked because people believed him. They believed he was doing something extraordinary, taking on a role few would volunteer for. But the more viewers re-examined the timeline, the more they saw how carefully constructed that image was. And while the audience was busy believing in his dedication, Eric was openly accepting donations far beyond what was needed. The Airbnb episode became one of the clearest examples. He claimed it was secured for the family, a safe place for the Whittakers to rest, sleep, and decompress. It needed to have multiple beds, he insisted, because he was taking responsibility for all of them. But the reality didn't match the story. No family members stayed there. Only Timmy slept there briefly. Most nights were spent with Eric and his friends occupying the space. And when questioned later, Eric admitted, casually, almost proudly, that the donations he received for the Airbnb alone exceeded a month of YouTube income. Nearly $40,000. This revelation caused viewers to reinterpret his earlier urgency about the rental. When he insisted on needing a large, expensive Airbnb, it wasn't about the Whittakers' comfort. It was about optics and income. The bigger the gesture, the bigger the donations. And the more people believed he was genuinely taking on an impossible burden, the more generous they became. By the time APS intervened, the narrative Eric built had become too tangled to maintain. His motives, once hidden behind charm and theatrics, now appeared obvious. A man who openly disliked work had attached himself to the most vulnerable family he could find, and crafted a public story that made him look like their savior while profiting from their suffering. His own statements began resurfacing in comment sections, quotes he likely assumed would be forgotten. Least work, most money. Timmy's easy. I don't have to watch over him. Just give him a bologna sandwich. It's too much work with the others. These weren't slip-ups. They were indicators. They were the truth he didn't bother hiding, because he assumed no one would ever question him. And for a long time, no one did. But when the family was taken, everything changed. People could finally see what had been there all along. A pattern built on convenience, profit, and minimal responsibility. The tragedy wasn't that the family needed intervention. The tragedy was who the system listened to before acting. They listened to a man who benefited financially from portraying the family as incapable. They listened to a man who inflated problems and minimized the family's strengths. They listened to someone whose public persona depended on painting himself as the only capable adult in the entire situation. Viewers now began asking a critical question. If the person claiming to help the family benefited from their downfall, why was he ever treated as a reliable narrator? The consequences of that oversight were irreversible. Ray was gone. Lorraine was gone. Timmy was gone. Betty's stability was shattered. The porch that defined their world was empty. And the man who orchestrated the narrative had already moved on, returning home, collecting donations, retreating into live streams where he alternated between self-praise and self-pity. Meanwhile, the viewers he once relied on for approval began turning against him. Not out of malice, but out of clarity. They saw the story behind the story. They saw how motivation shaped outcome. They saw how influence shaped perception. And most painfully, They saw how easy it had been for one man to manipulate an entire audience using the lives of people who couldn't fight back. The phrase, least work, most money, now had deeper meaning. It didn't just describe Eric's approach to content, it described his approach to people. Comment below and share your thoughts. As people revisited the timeline with clearer eyes, they began to notice that nothing Eric did existed in isolation. Every decision had a purpose. Every shift in focus predicted something else. The more viewers examined the months leading up to APS intervention, the more they saw how meticulously the situation had been shaped. It wasn't random. It wasn't impulsive. It was a slow, deliberate construction of a narrative that placed Eric at the center of a story he believed he could control. What emerged was a deeper understanding of the machine that fueled his motivations, a blend of ego, money, audience manipulation, and the intoxicating power that comes from controlling a vulnerable family's public identity. From the earliest videos, Eric recognized something others had missed. The Whittaker family generated immediate emotional investment. The unusual circumstances of their lives, the decades spent on the porch, the isolation, the poverty, the communication barriers, all of it created a kind of human curiosity that online audiences struggled to resist. He knew it instantly. And once he realized the potential, the content began flowing in a very specific pattern. The family wasn't presented as people with complexities. They were presented as characters, roles assigned based on what generated the strongest reaction. Ray became the fragile elder with a tragic innocence. Lorraine became the confused woman torn between two realities. Betty and Larry became the flawed caregivers the audience should question. BJ became the villain. Timmy became the star. And Eric became the rescuer. This layout wasn't accidental. It mirrored the oldest formula in online exploitation. Create a story of victims, villains, and heroes, then insert yourself as the one person capable of fixing everything. The more the audience believed the family was in danger, the more they relied on Eric to save them. And the more they relied on him, the more money flowed in. The donations, in many ways, became a psychological tether. People didn't just watch, they participated. They sent money believing they were helping the family, not realizing that Eric was often the only one benefiting. The Airbnb situation stood as proof. The moment people realized their generosity funded vacation-style lodging for Eric and his friends, not the family, the illusion of altruism cracked. Yet the illusion held long enough for him to accomplish what he needed, crafting a narrative that positioned him as the only responsible adult in a chaotic environment. That narrative became essential when he eventually involved APS. People began re-examining how he interacted with the family in the days leading up to their removal. The clips revealed a strange pattern of emotional cues. Moments where Eric would show the family struggling, moments where he exaggerated dangers, moments where he directed the camera in ways that amplified distress. These scenes weren't captured naturally. They were orchestrated to provoke concern from the audience and, eventually, from the authorities. But even more disturbing was how he softened the contrast between boosting Timmy and condemning the others. He framed himself as the one person who truly got through to Timmy, the one who could teach him things, the one who wouldn't let him down. While the rest of the family was painted as burdens or obstacles, Timmy was painted as pure potential, untapped, unprotected, and in desperate need of someone like Eric. This dual narrative demonized the family, idealized the child, set the stage for a larger plan. A plan in which Eric could justify inserting himself as a guardian, not because it was in Timmy's best interest, but because it aligned perfectly with Eric's desire for least work, most money. He said it himself, Timmy didn't require much supervision. Timmy didn't require personal sacrifice. Timmy wasn't physically demanding. And most importantly, Timmy's presence on camera drove engagement. The simplicity of Timmy's routine allowed Eric to continue creating content, managing donations, and maintaining his online persona without interruption. The other family members, with their complex needs and unpredictable behaviors, didn't fit that model. They needed support, patience, and long-term commitment, qualities Eric had no intention of providing. This became painfully clear when viewers analyzed the footage of Eric discussing cost and care. The numbers he listed were less about needs and more about justification. They provided a paper trail of evidence that the others were too expensive, too difficult, too inconvenient. They set the stage for his next move, pushing for custody of only one member of the family, Timmy. Once the narrative was in place, Eric began the second phase of the plan, emotionally separating Timmy from the others. He frequently portrayed Timmy as isolated, unsupported, and struggling. He exaggerated these claims to an audience already predisposed to believe him. At the same time, he criticized the other family members in ways that positioned them as helpless or harmful. His tone wasn't just judgmental. It was strategic. The audience eventually saw the pattern. Eric wasn't just building a case for why he should care for Timmy, he was building a case for why the others shouldn't. This narrative manipulation created a psychological divide between the family members and the viewers. People began rooting for Eric to take Timmy. They saw him as a savior stepping in to rescue a child from an unstable environment, a story Eric encouraged with every emotional clip, every strategically framed statement, every plea for donations framed as helping. But once APS intervened, everything collapsed. The entire system reacted not to truth but to Eric's portrayal of truth. And the moment they acted, the consequences became devastating and permanent. Ray was removed. Lorraine was removed. Timmy was removed. Betty's stability fractured. And the family that had survived decades of hardship on their porch was dismantled in a matter of days, not because of necessity, but because of a narrative designed for profit. When viewers realized this, anger turned into disbelief. And disbelief turned into an avalanche of questions. Why did Eric downplay the family's strengths? Why did he exaggerate their weaknesses? Why did he allow people to believe he was caring for them 24/7 when he spent most nights socializing? Why did he accept donations meant for the family while spending them on himself and his friends? Why did he fight so hard to take Timmy and not the others? And the question that now echoed louder than all the others: had anyone ever bothered to ask the family what they wanted? In hindsight, the answer was obvious. Because the narrative wasn't built for them. It was built around them. And built for him. The family's removal wasn't an accident. It was the predictable outcome of a story shaped by someone who understood how to manipulate an audience and how to use that influence to redirect the system itself. When people realized this, the anger became something deeper: grief. Grief not only for what happened to the family, but for what they represented: vulnerable individuals caught in the crossfire of digital exploitation, powerless to stop decisions being made in their name. The most tragic part was the realization that the Whittaker family had survived decades of poverty, isolation, and hardship without being torn apart. But once their lives collided with someone who lived by the principle, least work, most money, their world unraveled in weeks. It wasn't just a moral failure. It was a human failure. A failure amplified by cameras, clicks, and the illusion of online goodness. The viewers, once loyal to Eric, now became witnesses to a truth they couldn't ignore. A truth that destroyed the story they once believed. Eric didn't save the Whittakers. He profited from them. And the system helped him do it. Comment below and share your thoughts. When the dust finally settled and the Whittaker family was scattered into different facilities, the silence that followed became louder than any video Eric had ever produced. The porch, once the center of their world and the place where countless strangers first became fascinated with their lives, now sat empty. Not because the family outgrew it, not because they wanted to leave it behind, but because someone else rewrote their reality for them. That someone walked away untouched, while the family paid the price. In the aftermath, viewers began seeing the timeline with a clarity that felt almost cruel. Every moment that once seemed quirky or endearing now carried a darker undertone. Clips of Eric laughing while the family tried to follow along didn't look gentle anymore. His hurried instructions, his dismissive remarks, his selective editing, none of it looked the same. The story that had been packaged as compassion had revealed itself as calculation. For many, the turning point came when they revisited the moment Eric described why he preferred spending time with Timmy. It wasn't spoken with love. It wasn't spoken with admiration. It was spoken like a businessman justifying a decision. Timmy required less work. Timmy didn't challenge him. Timmy didn't interrupt his schedule. Timmy allowed him to keep earning money without sacrificing convenience. That single admission, said casually months earlier, now became the key that unlocked the truth behind everything that happened next. When APS made their decision, they didn't just remove vulnerable individuals from a complicated situation. They reacted to a narrative that had been shaped by a man who understood the power of implication. They reacted to the version of the story they were told, one filtered, edited, and rehearsed through Eric's lens. And because of that, the consequences fell not on him, but on the people who had no voice in how they were portrayed. There was no one to explain that the family had survived decades without incident. No one to clarify that their struggles were not new, but manageable within the structure they understood. No one to advocate for the fact that what viewers interpreted as dysfunction was, in reality, routine, imperfect but stable. Instead, APS received a narrative built on half-truths, dramatic framing, and selective compassion. A narrative designed not for accuracy, but for engagement. Viewers began to reckon with an unsettling truth. The family didn't lose their independence because of a crisis. They lost it because of content. In the months leading up to the intervention, Eric had gradually turned their lives into a series tailored for maximum emotional reaction. He showcased the moments that would shock viewers. He emphasized moments that would draw concern. He filmed scenes that invited judgment. The more people reacted, the more the story intensified. And the more intense the story became, the more justification APS had to intervene. What began as entertainment ended as a life-altering upheaval. And when the consequences finally hit, Eric was nowhere near the fallout. He wasn't there when Betty's world collapsed. He wasn't there when Timmy was taken. He wasn't there when Ray and Lorraine were separated from the only home they had ever known. He wasn't sitting with anyone trying to understand the system they had suddenly been pulled into. He wasn't there when the family members realized they were not going home. He had already moved on. Behind him remained a trail of confusion, heartbreak, and irreversible decisions, all disguised beneath months of curated care. As the online community grappled with the truth, many began to ask themselves why they hadn't seen it sooner. The signs had been there. The statements had been clear. Eric didn't speak in metaphors. He said exactly what he wanted, the least work and the most money. People simply didn't believe him because they didn't want to. It was easier to accept the hero narrative. Easier to believe that someone was doing good. Easier to assume that filmed kindness equaled real compassion. But compassion without sacrifice is performance. And Eric's own admissions proved he had no interest in sacrifice. In the end, it was the family, not Eric, who bore the consequences of a system tricked into reacting to a story instead of a situation. And perhaps the most heartbreaking realization was this: the Whittakers had never asked for any of it. They never sought fame. They never asked to be moved, filmed, analyzed, or judged. They lived quietly until someone saw an opportunity. And in that opportunity, everything they knew was undone. Now, the community is left wrestling with the moral cost of their own curiosity. The clicks, the views, the comments, the donations. In many ways, the audience was part of the machine. But the machine had a driver, and that driver had goals unrelated to the family's well-being. What remains today is the aftermath: a fractured family, a tarnished truth, and a digital trail revealing exactly how easily vulnerable lives can be reshaped by the wrong storyteller. The phrase, least work, most money, doesn't just describe Eric's behavior. It describes the engine that dismantled a family. It describes the mindset that fueled every decision. And it will forever define the story that followed. Whether people want to admit it or not, the truth has become undeniable. He didn't just fail the Whittakers, he used them. And once they were no longer useful, he left them behind. Comment below and share your thoughts. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.